Hello, my name is Dr. Eric Wesselmann. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Psychology at Illinois State University, and what I'm going to talk to you about today is some research that I've been doing, kind of spinning off some contributions that I've made to a series of edited books, taking popular culture titles and using them to talk about psychological topics to the general public. In this case, the ideas happen to come from my contribution to the Captain America vs. Iron Man, Freedom, Security, and Psychology book, edited by Dr. Travis Langley. And as I started writing chapters like this, it occurred to me that using the types of things that I've been doing in these chapters would be fun to use in the classroom as well. So what I'm going to be talking to you today specifically about the data I collected on using things like Marvel's Civil War to discuss psychological and philosophical topics around the concept of moral decision making to college students. To take a step back, I'm certainly not the first person to come up with this idea. There have been several different theorists from different fields. I've just pulled a couple here. For example, an edited book by Robin Rosenberg, which draws on some researchers from psychology as well as other disciplines, talking about the function that superheroes and superhero narratives have in our culture. Another great book by Richard Reynolds talks about it from the context of understanding superhero comics as mythology. And in addition to these researchers, other comics creators, for example, have also argued that these types of stories could be seen in mythological contexts. Mythology has many functions. One is certainly group bonding and in providing meaning to one's group identity, but also as a way to teach cultural values, not just to children, but really to people of any age, the sort of general didactic function of narratives. And so what I'm going to do is talk specifically about the story of Marvel's Civil War, which was an event that spanned multiple titles within the Marvel universe, and I'm arguing that it is a great narrative for describing what we know from the psychology of moral decision-making. Long and short of that is that moral decision-making seems intuitive to us when we're not in that moment, when we adopt a moral worldview, one that we generally learn through stories, for example, as well as other sorts of cultural influences. We adopt a moral framework, and once we go through that hard work, that framework becomes our worldview that essentially seems intuitive. It helps us navigate the complexities of life, and we forget the hard work that we went through to create that worldview. And when we are sitting here comfortably, we can think about moral issues and say, well, it's simple. This is right and this is wrong and this is what you have to do. But when you're actually in that moment of making the decision, psychology of moral decision making suggests that moral issues are ridiculously complex, and we have to go through a lot of cognitive work to come up with the quote-unquote right answer. That sort of dynamic is shown here just in the cover on the left-hand side of the screen, where Captain America, for example, you see there, and underneath him it says, "Whose side are you on?" Right? So the narrative framework is such that the writers are encouraging you to quote-unquote pick a side. Now, the side you pick, for example, is there's a huge tragedy that occurs in the Marvel Universe while some heroes are fighting villains, and a whole lot of innocent bystanders are killed, including many children. And so the heroes say, okay, something needs to change. And as a matter of fact, the American public goes to the legislatures and say these heroes need to be reined in. There needs to be some type of governmental oversight. And the heroes divide themselves on that issue as to whether they should be beholden to the government. And that's what the fight ultimately ends up becoming about, and over time, regardless of whose side you agree with initially, each side starts to do some really nasty things. Gets very morally gray. So what I've done across a variety of different classroom contexts, for example, a senior level capstone psychology seminar, as well as teaching in 200 level large lecture hall format, is I've talked about the psychological research on moral decision making, and I used examples from Civil War to illustrate these concepts. In my senior level class, I actually had students read the book. We then had in-class discussions and a reflection essay. In my 200 level course, rather than have them read that book, I rather just spent a week where I gave a couple of lectures on the same topics and used the same examples without actually having them do a deep dive into the material. And as you can see, particularly from the 200 level courses, we had both majors and non-majors, diverse grade levels, and just a couple examples of information about my sample. Very few of my students in any of these classes had read comic books before, as you can see. So most of them, if they had read comics, it was when they were younger, and so they didn't really have a whole lot of experience with comic book narratives. So this was a new experience for many of them. So what I did with all of these classes is that at the beginning of the semester, I got an assessment of their exposure to comic books, as I just showed you the distributions. I also asked them what they thought, or how they thought effective they thought that comics would be to communicate ideas and questions about morality to young children, adolescents, college students, and adults post-college. I asked them that at the beginning of the semester, before I gave my lectures on Marvel's Civil War, and then after I finished my lectures, and in the case of the small class, they gave reaction papers, etc. I then asked them these questions again in sort of a pre-post test design. We look at the small seminar where they actually did a deep dive into the material and read the text. We can see that across all four of those categories, they believed that the effectiveness of using comic books to have these conversations with each age group increased significantly. And just to give you an idea, I have the D-scores written there. D-score is an effect size that compares to means, and generally speaking in the social sciences, 0.8 is considered to be a large effect, and so in this case we well exceeded that line, so there's nothing above large, but just to give you a general idea of magnitude, that these were pretty strong effects. A couple examples of quotes from students in their reaction papers. After reading Civil War comics, I believe that comic books can be a useful tool for discussing moral and ethical issues. The separation from the real world that comic books like this create allows for a safer way to discuss morals and ethics in a way that seems less personal when arguing aside. Another student wrote, Civil War was the first comic book I read. I enjoyed the comic book, which I doubted earlier, and realized that readers of the comic book and others can learn moral and ethical issues in the superhero world. Then I did this in two different large lecture halls. The big difference between the studies is that in study 2, because of a clerical error, I was unable to connect their pre- and post-test scores, so I simply did a one-sample t-test on the post-test score using the means of the pre-test. And in this third study that I have, I was able to actually connect their pre and post, and so in that case it was a within subjects design. And basically I had the same effects that you saw in the senior seminar class, where they engaged in lots of reflection about the material. So when they were just given examples in a lecture hall format, we see that once again there was large effects across all four age group categories in terms of perceived effectiveness. And there, just to show you the data for the third study, once again, same thing. So in conclusion, whether it is in a small seminar where I actually had the students engage in the full text, or I simply, in a large lecture format, just provided them key panels of the comic. Across the board, students who had very little experience with comics after the fact believed that it would be effective to use these types of superhero comic stories to discuss the complexity of moral decision making among not just college students, which as they are, but adults post-college, adolescents, and even young children. I'll close with a nice quote here from one of my senior students. In their reflection paper, they said, "Morality is very complex in that different moral decisions can always be justified. As humans, we justify our decisions every day," which was basically the take-home of psychology of moral decision-making.